As a classical musician, do you feel at a loss when you see how casually jazz musicians handle dissonance? Do jazz arrangements seem arbitrary to you when it comes to the use of dissonant sounds? By the end of this video, you'll understand how differently classical musicians and jazz musicians perceive dissonance, and why jazz musicians don't call them dissonances, but rather tensions. Take this sound, for example. In classical harmony, it's an augmented sixth chord with complicated resolution rules. And the jazz musician? He simply sees a scale. There is an amusing jazz standard that Ella Fitzgerald and Louis Armstrong made famous in a legendary recording, the Gershwin brothers' song Let's Call the Whole Thing Off. In it, the two delightfully mock the fact that they pronounce many words differently. The lyrics culminate in the realization that, despite our different ways of naming things, we need one another. This peculiarity of naming things differently is also found in the relationship between jazz and European art music. We want to illustrate this using a fundamental concept, dissonance as Europeans call it, or tension as jazz musicians refer to it. One must realize that classical harmony and jazz harmony employ different concepts for dealing with, let's say, tricky notes. In the harmony of Western European art music, these are called dissonances. In jazz harmony, they are called tensions. These are two different but, in a certain sense, parallel concepts. Unlike the tomatoes, potatoes, oysters, and pajamas that Lewis and Ella sing about, they don't just call things by different names. Although they serve a comparable function within their respective systems, their usage also differs in important ways. In European music theory between 1600 and 1900, the so-called common practice period, consonances are intervals that sound pleasant and can stand on their own. Dissonances, on the other hand, are intervals that sound unpleasant or tense, and must therefore be resolved into consonances. Consonances are divided into perfect and imperfect. The perfect ones are the unison, fifth, and octave. Third and sixth intervals are considered imperfect. Dissonances are seconds, sevenths, and the tritone. And there is a special case. The fourth is either consonant or dissonant depending on the context. As far as the theory of European art music is concerned, Igor Stravinsky, at the latest, put an end to the concept in theory. In his 1947 Harvard Lectures, published under the title The Poetics of Music, he says, "In textbook language, dissonance is an element of transition, a complex or interval of tones which is not complete in itself, and which must be resolved to the ear's satisfaction into a perfect consonance. But nothing forces us to be constantly seeking satisfaction that resides only in repose." And for over a century, music has provided repeated examples of a style in which dissonance has emancipated itself. It is no longer bound to its former function. Having become an entity in itself, it frequently happens that dissonance neither prepares nor anticipates anything. Dissonance is thus no more an agent of disorder than consonance is a guarantee of security. The music of yesterday and of today unhesitatingly unites parallel dissonant chords that thereby lose their functional value, and our ear quite naturally accepts their juxtaposition. We thus no longer find ourselves within the framework of classical tonality in the scholastic sense of the word. Jazz entered the world stage when the concepts of dissonance and consonance had long since blurred in art music. By 1947, it had long since adopted this view of dissonances. Jazz musicians therefore do not call anything that is not consonance a dissonance, but rather a tension. The term also reflects the fact that jazz has a complex, nuanced conception of what chords are. For the jazz musician, they are stacked thirds. The chord tones, root, third, and fifth, correspond to classical consonances. The tensions are the notes added as the thirds are further stacked. 7th, 9th, 11th, and 13th, and thus also the 2nd, 4th, and 6th. The latter closes the cycle of thirds. In jazz, tensions do not need to be resolved like the dissonances in classical harmony. They merely impart a certain coloration to the chords. The 9th, 4th, and 6th can be altered in the process. But there is also a special case in jazz. The minor 9th sounds dissonant or merely very expressive, depending on the context. We must point out here that the term interval unfortunately has two different meanings in music theory, which repeatedly leads to confusion. On the one hand, we use it to denote the frequency ratio between two notes. On the other hand, however, it refers to the steps of a scale: the root, the second, the third, the fourth, the fifth, the sixth, the seventh, and the octave. If, for example, we form a dominant seventh chord, we stack the third, fifth, and minor seventh on top of each other, whereby, according to the definition of the interval as the distance between two notes, we always calculate the distance from the root. Confusion arises when, for example, we form a chord inversion. We still speak of the third, the fifth, and the seventh of the chord, but we find no interval in the first sense of the term seventh. The so-called seventh in the first inversion, together with the other notes, forms merely a tritone, a minor third, and a major second. So are tensions actually pure dissonances, or rather functions within a scale? It is clear that the terms quickly become blurred as soon as systems reach a certain level of complexity. We can demonstrate the difference between dissonance in classical harmony and tensions in jazz harmony using the example of the minuet from Beethoven's 20th Piano Sonata. Generally, consonances dominate the original piano part. The C of the tritone C F-sharp must be resolved a semitone lower to B, and the F-sharp a semitone higher to G. This is different in a simplified jazz version. There are virtually no chords that are not finely drawn out or colored by tensions. The B and E in the D major chord are colorings as tensions that require no special treatment. The same applies to the F-sharp in the G major chord. The E-flat in the half-diminished A minor chord borrowed from the minor key is also merely a coloration, and the E in the concluding G major chord stands on its own. The major chord with a sixth is a popular closing chord in traditional jazz. Somehow, the jazzed-up version sounds almost a bit like French Impressionism, like Debussy or Satie, doesn't it? In fact, jazz harmony shares affinities with Impressionist harmony. Here, too, the boundaries between jazz and European art music and their terminology are already blurring. Here, too, the concepts of dissonance and tension are difficult to distinguish clearly from one another. This video shows just how context-dependent the interpretation of another fundamental concept of classical harmony must be. The notorious prohibition of parallel fifths is another aspect of a music theory that cannot distinguish between right and wrong, but merely provides tools to achieve certain effects. Check it out. And subscribe to our channel because the best is yet to come. And feel free to write in the comments how you see the differences and similarities between jazz and European art music.